Marcus Thompson sat on the cracked concrete steps of his run-down apartment building, watching the evening shadows stretch across the empty street. The autumn air carried the smell of fried food from the corner bodega and exhaust fumes from passing cars. His worn military jacket hung loose on his thin frame, the fabric faded from years of wear since his discharge from the Marines 3 years ago. The eviction notice crumpled in his pocket felt heavier than any equipment he had carried during his 2 tours in Afghanistan. 30 days to find $800 or lose the only roof he had left. His disability check barely covered groceries, let alone rent. The job interviews had dried up months ago, and his savings account showed a balance that wouldn't buy him a decent meal. Marcus rubbed his left knee, feeling the familiar ache where shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone during his final mission overseas. The VA hospital had patched him up well enough to walk, but the nightmares and the constant pain made holding down regular work nearly impossible. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the sound of explosions that existed only in his memory. His phone buzzed with another message from his landlord, Mr. Rodriguez. The old man had been patient, more patient than Marcus deserved, but even kindness had its limits. The building needed repairs, and Rodriguez had his own family to feed. Marcus understood, but understanding didn't make the situation any easier. The streetlights flickered on as darkness settled over the neighborhood. This part of the city wasn't dangerous exactly, but it wasn't safe either. Drug dealers worked the corners 3 blocks over, and the sound of sirens was as common as traffic noise. Most people minded their own business and kept their heads down, which suited Marcus fine. He wasn't looking for trouble or attention. A group of teenagers walked past, their laughter echoing off the brick walls. They reminded him of his younger brother David, who was finishing his senior year of high school back in Ohio. David had been sending texts asking when Marcus would visit, but how could he explain that he couldn't afford a bus ticket home? How could he tell his family that the war hero they were proud of was living paycheck to paycheck in a neighborhood they wouldn't recognize? Marcus pulled his jacket tighter as the temperature dropped. The weather forecast called for an early frost, and his apartment's heating system was about as reliable as his job prospects. He'd spent worse nights in worse conditions during his service, but somehow civilian poverty felt different. In the military, hardship had purpose and brotherhood. Here it just felt like failure. His stomach growled, reminding him that the peanut butter sandwich he'd eaten for lunch was his only meal of the day. The corner store stayed open late, and maybe he could afford a can of soup if he counted his change carefully. He stood up slowly, his knee protesting the movement, and started walking toward the bright neon signs that promised cheap food and lottery dreams. The owner of the bodega, Mrs. Chen, had always been friendly to him. She'd served in the army herself decades ago and recognized something familiar in his careful way of scanning rooms and positioning himself near exits. Sometimes she'd slip an extra item into his bag without charging for it, a small kindness that meant more than she probably realized. As Marcus approached the store, he noticed a young woman walking about half a block ahead of him. She moved quickly, glancing over her shoulder every few steps. Her body language triggered his military training. The way she held her purse close and kept checking behind her. Something was wrong. 3 men emerged from an alley, moving with the predatory coordination that Marcus recognized from countless briefings about urban threats. They spread out to cut off the woman's escape routes, their intentions clear even from a distance. The woman quickened her pace, but she was trapped between the approaching men and a dead-end street. Marcus felt his heart rate spike. Not from fear, but from the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with identifying a threat. His training kicked in automatically, assessing the situation and calculating options. 3 against 1, all of them younger and probably stronger than his damaged body could handle. The smart move would be to call the police and hope they arrived in time. But the woman's terrified face reminded him of his sister, of the Iraqi civilians he'd sworn to protect, of every person who needed help and had no one else to turn to. The oath he'd taken as a Marine hadn't expired with his discharge papers. Some promises were for life. Marcus reached into his pocket and felt the familiar weight of his phone. He could dial 911, but by the time help arrived, it would be too late. The men were already closing in, their voices carrying threats and demands that made the woman stumble backward in fear. Without fully realizing he'd made the decision, Marcus found himself walking faster toward the confrontation. His knee screamed in protest, but he ignored the pain. Years of physical therapy had taught him the difference between discomfort and actual damage. and right now discomfort was irrelevant. The largest of the three men grabbed the woman's arm, causing her to cry out. That sound cut through the evening air like a combat alarm, triggering responses that Marcus thought he'd left behind in the desert. He wasn't a broke veteran struggling to pay rent anymore. He was a Marine and someone needed his help. Marcus picked up his pace, his mind already working through tactical approaches and probable outcomes. He'd been in worse situations with better odds, but he'd also had backup and proper equipment then. Tonight, all he had was muscle memory and the conviction that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. The woman saw him approaching, and her eyes widened with a mixture of hope and fear. She didn't know if this stranger would help her or make things worse. Marcus met her gaze for just a moment and nodded slightly, the same gesture he'd used to reassure frightened civilians in a dozen different war zones. He was 20 feet away when the largest attacker noticed him. The man turned with the casual confidence of someone used to intimidating others, expecting to see another victim or potential witness to scare away. Instead, he found himself looking at someone whose posture and bearing suggested military training and the kind of controlled violence that came with it. The confrontation unfolded with the terrible clarity that Marcus remembered from combat zones. The largest attacker, a man with gang tattoos covering his neck and arms, sized up Marcus with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to violence. His two companions flanked him, one thin and nervous, the other built like a linebacker with scarred knuckles that spoke of frequent fights. "Walk away." "Old man," the leader growled, his grip tightening on the woman's arm. "This ain't your business." Marcus stopped about 10 feet away, his stance balanced and ready. The military bearing was unmistakable now, the way he held his hands loose at his sides and kept his weight distributed for quick movement. "Let her go," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd given orders under fire. The woman, a college student named Sarah Martinez, looked between Marcus and her attackers with growing terror. She'd been walking home from her evening job at the campus library when these men had cornered her. Her phone was in her backpack, unreachable now with one arm pinned behind her. The nervous attacker shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with this unexpected development. "Come on, Rico," he muttered to the leader. "Let's just take the purse and go." Rico's eyes never left Marcus. Something about the older man's calm demeanor and ready stance suggested this wouldn't be as easy as rolling another victim. But backing down in front of his crew wasn't an option, especially not from some broken-down veteran who probably couldn't run a block without collapsing. "I said walk away," Rico repeated, pulling a knife from his jacket pocket. The blade caught the streetlight, throwing sharp reflections across the brick walls. "Unless you want to join her in learning some manners." Marcus's eyes tracked the knife automatically, his mind cataloging the weapon's reach and the attacker's grip. He'd disarmed dozens of combatants during his service, but that was years ago when his body was whole and his reflexes sharp. Now, with his damaged knee and the weight of civilian life dulling his edge, the odds were significantly worse. "Sarah, when I say run, you run toward the bodega," Marcus said without taking his eyes off Rico. "Don't look back." Sarah's eyes widened at hearing her name. She hadn't told him what to call her, but somehow this stranger had made her safety his responsibility. The certainty in his voice gave her the first hope she'd felt since the men had appeared. Rico laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the surrounding buildings. "You think you're some kind of hero? This is real life, not some war movie." He nodded to his companions and they began to spread out, moving to surround Marcus. The linebacker, who went by Tank, cracked his knuckles loudly. "Should have minded your own business. Soldier boy." His voice carried the kind of casual cruelty that came from years of hurting people weaker than himself. Marcus felt the familiar pre-combat calm settling over him. Time seemed to slow as his training took over, reading body language and positioning, calculating angles and distances. The nervous one would break first if pressured. Rico was the real threat, experienced and confident with the blade. Tank was strong but probably relied too much on size and intimidation. "Last chance," Rico said, taking a step forward. "Walk away or we'll put you in the hospital right next to her." Instead of retreating, Marcus moved slightly to his left, positioning himself between Sarah and the largest concentration of threats. The movement was subtle but professional, the kind of tactical repositioning that civilians wouldn't notice, but that trained fighters would recognize immediately. Rico's expression shifted from confidence to wariness. This wasn't going according to the usual script. Most people faced with three armed attackers either ran or froze in terror. This man was calmly preparing for a fight he couldn't possibly win. "Run," Marcus said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a command. Sarah didn't hesitate. She broke free from Rico's momentarily loosened grip and sprinted toward the bodega, her footsteps echoing on the pavement. Rico cursed and lunged after her, but Marcus stepped directly into his path. The collision was brutal and immediate. Rico's knife swept in a vicious arc toward Marcus's midsection, but the veteran's muscle memory kicked in. He twisted away from the blade while grabbing Rico's wrist, using the attacker's momentum to throw him off balance. Tank rushed in from the side, throwing a haymaker punch that would have flattened most men. Marcus ducked under the swing and drove his elbow upward into Tank's solar plexus, doubling him over with a gasp. But the movement put pressure on his damaged knee, sending a spike of pain up his leg that nearly dropped him. The nervous attacker, emboldened by Marcus's momentary weakness, grabbed a broken bottle from the ground and swung it at the veteran's head. Marcus raised his arm to block, feeling glass bite into his forearm as blood began to flow. Rico had recovered his balance and came at Marcus again, the knife weaving in practiced patterns. This time, Marcus wasn't quick enough to avoid the blade entirely. It sliced across his ribs, opening a gash that immediately began bleeding through his jacket. "Should have walked away," Rico panted, circling for another attack. Marcus backed against a brick wall, his options narrowing with each second. His knee was screaming, his arm was bleeding, and his ribs felt like they were on fire. But Sarah was safely away, and that had to count for something. Tank had recovered from the elbow strike and grabbed Marcus by the shoulders, trying to hold him steady for Rico's next knife thrust. Marcus drove his head forward in a vicious headbutt that broke Tank's nose with a wet crunch. But the big man's grip didn't loosen. The nervous attacker smashed the broken bottle against Marcus's shoulder, sending glass shards into his jacket and the flesh beneath. Marcus grunted but stayed upright, his military training keeping him focused despite the mounting injuries. Rico stepped in for what he intended to be the finishing blow, the knife aimed at Marcus's heart. But the veteran had one more move left, a desperate gambit that relied more on surprise than strength. He let his injured leg collapse, dropping him below Rico's strike while simultaneously grabbing the attacker's knife hand and twisting with all his remaining strength. The knife clattered to the pavement as Rico screamed, his wrist bent at an unnatural angle. But Tank still had Marcus in a bear hug, and the third attacker was reaching for the fallen blade. Marcus was running out of time and options, his vision starting to blur from blood loss and exhaustion. Marcus felt Tank's massive arms crushing his ribs as the nervous attacker scrambled for the fallen knife. His vision was beginning to tunnel, dark spots dancing at the edges as blood loss and lack of oxygen took their toll. Years of combat experience told him he was losing this fight, but something deeper than training refused to let him quit. With Tank's arms locked around him from behind, Marcus had limited options. He drove his heel down onto Tank's instep with all the force he could muster, feeling bones crack through the man's sneakers. Tank's grip loosened just enough for Marcus to twist and drive his elbow backward into the bigger man's already broken nose. Tank released him with a howl of pain, stumbling backward with blood streaming down his face. But the nervous attacker had recovered the knife and was advancing with shaking hands, clearly terrified but committed to finishing what they'd started. "You should have stayed down," the man whispered, his voice trembling as much as his hands. The knife wavered in his grip, but at close range, even a nervous amateur could do fatal damage. Marcus backed against the brick wall again, his injured leg barely supporting his weight. Rico was on his knees, cradling his twisted wrist and cursing in both English and Spanish. Tank was struggling to see through the blood streaming from his nose. But the third attacker was still dangerous, fear making him unpredictable. The knife came forward in a clumsy thrust aimed at Marcus's stomach. The veteran managed to deflect it with his forearm, but the blade sliced through his jacket sleeve and opened another gash along his arm. The pain was becoming a constant background noise now, his body's way of telling him he was approaching his limits. Tank wiped blood from his eyes and charged again, his broken nose making him even more vicious. He caught Marcus around the waist in a tackle that drove both men to the ground. Marcus's head bounced off the concrete, sending stars exploding across his vision. The nervous attacker stood over them, knife raised for a downward strike that would end the fight permanently. Marcus could see the blade descending, could feel Tank's weight pinning him to the cold pavement. Time seemed to slow as he realized he might have saved Sarah only to die himself in this dirty alley. Then the sound of sirens cut through the night air, growing rapidly louder. Mrs. Chen had called the police when Sarah burst into her store, bleeding from where she'd scraped her hands during her escape. The cavalry was coming, but Marcus wasn't sure he'd last long enough to see them arrive. The nervous attacker hesitated, the knife frozen in mid-strike as he processed the approaching sirens. That moment of indecision saved Marcus's life, giving him the opening he needed to grab Tank's head and slam it against the pavement with what little strength he had left. Tank's grip loosened as his eyes rolled back, consciousness slipping away from the combined effects of his injuries and the impact with the concrete. Marcus rolled free just as the nervous attacker decided to flee, dropping the knife and running toward the alley's mouth. Rico was already trying to stand, his good hand pressed against the wall for support. He looked at Marcus with a mixture of rage and grudging respect. "This ain't over, soldier," he spat before limping after his fleeing companion. Marcus lay on the cold concrete, staring up at the narrow strip of sky visible between the buildings. His body was a catalog of pain and injury, 7 distinct wounds from knife cuts, broken glass, and blunt force trauma. Blood pooled beneath him, mixing with the dirt and debris of the alley floor. The sirens were much closer now, their wailing echo bouncing off the brick walls. Marcus tried to sit up but found that his body wasn't quite ready to cooperate. His vision kept sliding in and out of focus, and his hands were shaking from either cold or shock. Tank was unconscious beside him, breathing but clearly in need of medical attention. The big man's face was a mess of blood and swelling, his broken nose twisted at an impossible angle. Marcus felt no satisfaction in the damage he'd inflicted, only the weary relief of someone who'd survived another impossible situation. Red and blue lights began flashing against the alley walls as police cars arrived. Marcus could hear car doors slamming and voices shouting orders, the familiar chaos of first responders arriving at a crime scene. He raised his good arm to signal his location, hoping they'd find him before he passed out entirely. Officer Jennifer Walsh was the first to reach him, her flashlight beam cutting through the shadows to illuminate the scene. She'd been a cop for 12 years and had seen plenty of violence, but something about this felt different. The unconscious man was clearly a criminal, his gang tattoos and the weapons scattered around him telling an obvious story. But the injured man sitting against the wall had the bearing of someone who'd fought to protect rather than harm. "Sir, can you hear me?" Walsh asked, kneeling beside Marcus and checking his pulse. "Paramedics are on the way." Marcus nodded weakly, trying to focus on her face. "The woman," he managed to say.
"Sarah, is she safe?"
"She's fine," Walsh assured him. "She's the one who called this in." "What's your name?" "Marcus Thompson," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Former Marine." Walsh's expression shifted slightly as she processed that information. She'd worked with enough veterans to recognize the signs, the way they carried themselves even when injured, the automatic concern for others before themselves. "What happened here, Marcus?" Before he could answer, the paramedics arrived with their equipment and urgent efficiency. They quickly assessed his injuries, establishing IV lines and preparing him for transport to the hospital. Marcus tried to stay conscious as they worked, but the combination of blood loss and exhaustion was overwhelming. 7 lacerations, possible concussion, and signs of significant trauma to the left knee. One paramedic reported to his partner, "We need to move fast." As they loaded him onto a stretcher, Marcus caught a glimpse of Sarah talking to another officer near the bodega. She was wrapped in a blanket but appeared unharmed, exactly as he'd hoped when he'd made the decision to intervene. The sight gave him a sense of completion that made it easier to let consciousness slip away. The ambulance ride to City General Hospital passed in a blur of sirens and medical procedures. Marcus drifted in and out of awareness, his mind processing the night's events in fragments. He'd done what felt right, what his training and conscience had demanded. The consequences would have to sort themselves out later. Dr. Patricia Hernandez was waiting when they wheeled him into the emergency room. She'd already been briefed on his injuries and was prepared for what looked like a complex case. As the trauma team went to work cleaning wounds and assessing damage, she couldn't help but notice the old scars that covered Marcus's body. This man had clearly seen violence before, probably more than his share. Dr. Hernandez worked through the early morning hours, carefully cleaning and suturing Marcus's wounds. Each injury told part of the story of his desperate fight to protect a stranger. The knife cuts required 37 stitches total. The glass wounds needed careful extraction of fragments, and his knee would need extensive evaluation once the more urgent injuries were stabilized. "This man's been through hell," she murmured to Nurse Rodriguez as they finished the last suture. "These aren't random injuries. Someone fought hard for something important." Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the night, his dreams mixing combat memories with the recent violence. Sometimes he was back in Afghanistan, protecting a convoy from insurgent attack. Other times he was in the alley again, watching Sarah run to safety. The distinction between past and present blurred in his medicated mind. When he finally woke up completely, sunlight was streaming through the hospital window. His body felt like it had been hit by a truck, every movement sending sharp reminders of the previous night's battle. But he was alive, and based on the quiet bustle of hospital activity around him, Sarah was safe. A young police detective named Michael Chen was sitting in a chair beside his bed, notepad ready. He looked tired, like he'd been there for a while. "Mr. Thompson? I'm Detective Chen. When you're ready, I'd like to get your statement about what happened last night." Marcus tried to sit up, wincing as his injured ribs protested. "Sarah Martinez. Is she okay?" "She's fine," Chen assured him. "Shaken up but physically unharmed. She wanted me to thank you for what you did. Not many people would have stepped in like that." "Anyone would have done the same thing," Marcus said, though he knew that wasn't true. He'd seen enough bystander apathy in both civilian life and combat zones to know that courage was rarer than people like to believe. Chen spent the next hour taking Marcus's statement, documenting every detail of the attack and the fight that followed. The detective's questions were thorough but respectful, clearly recognizing that Marcus was the victim here despite being the most severely injured person involved. "The man you fought, Rico Valdez, he's got a long record," Chen explained. "Assault, robbery, drug dealing. His friends too. Tank Morrison is still in the ICU with a severe concussion. And the third guy, Jimmy Santos, we picked up 2 blocks away with your blood on his clothes." Marcus nodded, processing the information. These weren't desperate people making a bad choice, they were career criminals who'd made violence their profession. Sarah had been unlucky enough to cross their path, and he'd been unlucky enough to care about a stranger's safety. "Will they go to prison?" Marcus asked. "With your testimony and the physical evidence, absolutely," Chen replied. "Rico's looking at 10 to 15 years, especially with his priors. Tank will do serious time too, assuming he recovers. Santos might get a plea deal if he cooperates." After Chen left, Marcus was alone with his thoughts and his pain medication. The hospital room was private, which surprised him given his financial situation. He'd have to ask about the cost once he was thinking more clearly. The bills from this would probably bankrupt him completely, but that seemed like a problem for future Marcus to solve. Dr. Hernandez stopped by during her afternoon rounds, checking his wounds and his overall condition. She was a small woman with kind eyes and the efficient manner of someone who'd spent years dealing with trauma cases. "Your injuries are healing well," she said, unwrapping the bandage on his forearm to inspect the stitches. "But I'm concerned about your knee. The X-rays show significant old damage that was aggravated during the fight. You should consider seeing an orthopedic specialist." "Can't afford specialists," Marcus said quietly. "Can barely afford regular doctors." Dr. Hernandez paused in her examination, studying his face. "You're a veteran, aren't you? I can see the old shrapnel scars. Marines, 2 tours in Afghanistan, then you qualify for VA care. Have you been using their services?" Marcus shrugged, immediately regretting the movement as his ribs protested. "Some. The bureaucracy is a nightmare and the waiting lists are months long. Easier to just deal with it myself." "Not anymore," she said firmly. "After what you did last night, dealing with pain alone isn't noble, it's just stubborn. I'm going to make some calls." Before Marcus could protest, there was a knock on his door. A young woman with dark hair and nervous eyes peered in hesitantly. It took him a moment to recognize Sarah Martinez without the fear and terror that had marked her face the night before. "Mr. Thompson, I hope it's okay that I came. I wanted to thank you properly." "Just Marcus," he said, struggling to sit up straighter. "And you don't need to thank me. I'm just glad you're safe." Sarah stepped into the room, carrying a small bouquet of flowers that looked like they'd come from the hospital gift shop. "The police told me about your injuries. 7 different wounds, and you got them all protecting someone you'd never met. Anyone would have—" "No." Sarah interrupted, her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes. Anyone wouldn't have. I was working late at the library, taking the same route home I've taken 100 times. Those men came out of nowhere, and I thought— She paused, wiping her eyes. I thought terrible things were going to happen to me. Then you appeared. Marcus didn't know what to say to that. In the military, protecting others had been his job, his duty, and his honor. In civilian life, it had just felt like the right thing to do. The idea that his actions were somehow extraordinary made him uncomfortable. The police said you're a veteran, Sarah continued, and that you're having some financial difficulties. I'm a journalism student, and I've been writing about veteran issues for my senior project. Would you mind if I told your story? My story isn't that interesting, Marcus protested. Just a guy who saw someone in trouble and tried to help. That's exactly why it's interesting, Sarah said. Heroes don't think they're heroes. They just think they're doing what anyone would do, but they're wrong. After Sarah left, Marcus lay back against his pillows and stared at the ceiling. His body hurt. His future was uncertain, and the medical bills from this night would probably follow him for years. But Sarah was safe. Her attackers were in custody, and somehow that felt worth all the pain and trouble. He dozed fitfully through the evening, his sleep interrupted by nurses checking his wounds and vital signs. The pain medication made everything feel distant and surreal, like he was watching someone else's life through a fog. When he woke up around midnight, there was another visitor in his room. Master Sergeant Patricia Williams sat in the chair beside his bed, her Marine dress uniform crisp and formal despite the late hour. She was an older woman with gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in the Corps. Marcus had never seen her before, but her presence immediately commanded respect. Corporal Thompson, she said, using his old rank. I'm Master Sergeant Williams from Marine Corps Community Services. I understand you had quite an evening. Marcus struggled to sit up straighter, instinctively responding to the presence of a senior Marine even in his injured state. Master Sergeant Williams raised a hand to stop him, her expression softening slightly. At ease, Marine. I'm not here in any official capacity that requires military bearing. She settled back in her chair, studying his bandaged form with experienced eyes. Though I have to say, what you did last night would make any Marine proud. How did you hear about it? Marcus asked, genuinely puzzled. He couldn't imagine how a random street fight would come to the attention of Marine Corps Community Services. Williams smiled, the first hint of warmth in her otherwise professional demeanor. A journalism student named Sarah Martinez contacted the local Marine recruiting station. She was trying to track down information about veteran support services for a story she's writing. When she described what happened and mentioned your name, Sergeant Rivera remembered processing your discharge paperwork 3 years ago. Marcus felt a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. He'd specifically asked Sarah not to make a big deal out of what had happened, but apparently she'd decided to pursue the story anyway. I told her it wasn't worth writing about. Marines are terrible at recognizing their own heroism, Williams observed. It's both our greatest strength and our biggest weakness. You saved that young woman from a violent assault, possibly rape, and certainly severe trauma, but you see it as just doing your job. It felt like the right thing to do, Marcus said simply. Exactly. Williams pulled out a folder and placed it on the bedside table, which brings me to why I'm here. Your discharge paperwork indicates you were medically retired due to combat injuries, but you've been struggling to access appropriate veteran services. That ends now. She opened the folder, revealing several official-looking documents. I've expedited your applications for increased disability compensation, housing assistance, and comprehensive medical care through the VA. The bureaucratic delays that have been keeping you in limbo are about to disappear. Marcus stared at the papers, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. I've been trying to navigate that system for 3 years. How did you manage this overnight? Because sometimes the system needs a firm push from someone who knows which buttons to press, Williams replied. And because what you did last night reminded a lot of people why we serve in the first place. There are Marines currently working your case at multiple levels who consider it a personal mission to ensure you get the support you've earned. She pointed to specific sections of the paperwork as she explained. Your disability rating is being increased from 40% to 70%, which will nearly double your monthly compensation. You're being fast-tracked for housing assistance that will cover your rent and utilities. and Dr. Hernandez spoke with VA Medical about your knee injury. You have an appointment with their best orthopedic surgeon next week. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of fortune. After years of struggling alone, the idea that help was actually available seemed almost too good to be true. Why now? What changed? You reminded people that being a Marine doesn't end when you take off the uniform, William said. Your actions last night embodied everything the Corps stands for: honor, courage, and commitment. When Marines take care of others, other Marines take care of them. It's how the system is supposed to work. She stood up, smoothing her uniform. There's one more thing. The local news picked up Sarah's story, and it's generating a lot of attention. The Marine Corps League is setting up a fund to help with your immediate expenses, and several local businesses have reached out about employment opportunities. I don't want charity, Marcus said quietly, his pride struggling with his desperation. It's not charity, Williams replied firmly. It's Marines taking care of Marines. You've given enough, Thompson. It's time to let others give back. After she left, Marcus lay in the darkness thinking about how dramatically his life had changed in less than 24 hours. Yesterday morning, he'd been facing eviction and homelessness. Tonight, he had medical care, housing assistance, and the promise of meaningful employment. All because he'd made a split-second decision to help a stranger in danger. The next morning brought a parade of visitors. Dr. Hernandez stopped by with good news about his healing progress and details about his upcoming VA appointments. Detective Chen returned with updates on the criminal case and paperwork for victim compensation. Even Mr. Rodriguez, his landlord, appeared with flowers and an apology for the eviction notice. I had no idea about your military service, the elderly man said, clearly emotional. My son served in Iraq. When I saw the news story, the rent can wait, Marcus. You focus on getting better. But the most surprising visitor was Sarah Martinez, who arrived with a laptop and a determined expression. She'd written her story about the attack and wanted his permission before submitting it to the local newspaper. I kept your privacy in mind, she assured him, showing him the article on her screen. No personal details about your financial situation or specific address. Just the facts about what happened and your military background. Marcus read through the piece slowly, surprised by how she'd captured the events without sensationalizing them. The article focused on the courage required to intervene in a dangerous situation and the ongoing struggles many veterans faced in civilian life. It was respectful, factual, and more complimentary than he felt comfortable with. You make me sound like some kind of superhero, he said with a weak smile. To me, you are, Sarah replied without hesitation. But more importantly, you're an example of what real heroism looks like. It's not flashy or glamorous. It's just someone doing the right thing when it matters most. The article was published that afternoon, and by evening, Marcus's hospital room had become an informal gathering place for well-wishers. Fellow veterans stopped by to shake his hand and share their own stories. Local business owners brought job offers and cards of support. Even complete strangers sent flowers and notes of gratitude. The attention made Marcus uncomfortable, but he was beginning to understand that his actions had resonated with people in ways he hadn't expected. In a world where bad news dominated headlines, his story offered something different, proof that ordinary people could still do extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it, Mester. Sergeant Williams returned that evening with final paperwork and a surprise. The Commandant of the Marine Corps has heard about your actions, she announced. You're being considered for a Civilian Commendation Award. Marcus shook his head in disbelief. For a street fight? For embodying Marine values in civilian life, Williams corrected. For proving that the oath we take doesn't expire with our discharge papers. For showing that Marines protect others regardless of personal cost. As the week progressed and his physical injuries began to heal, Marcus found himself adapting to a completely new reality. The VA had expedited his medical care, providing pain management for his knee and therapy for the psychological wounds that had gone untreated for too long. The housing assistance meant he could afford not just his current apartment, but potentially something better in a safer neighborhood. Most importantly, several local employers had reached out with job opportunities that seemed both meaningful and well-suited to his skills. A private security firm wanted to hire him as a trainer, teaching their employees how to handle dangerous situations. A youth organization was looking for someone to work with at-risk teenagers, using military discipline and structure to help them find better paths. The transformation was so complete and so rapid that Marcus sometimes wondered if he was dreaming. But the healing wounds on his body and the gratitude in Sarah's eyes whenever she visited reminded him that everything was very real. He'd made a choice to help someone in need, and that choice had somehow opened doors he'd never imagined existed. 2 weeks after the attack, Marcus was finally discharged from the hospital with a clean bill of health and a comprehensive treatment plan for his ongoing medical needs. The VA had assigned him a caseworker, Jennifer Walsh, who happened to be the police officer who'd first responded to the scene that night. She'd left the force to work in veteran services, finding more satisfaction in helping people rebuild their lives than in processing crime scenes. "It's not often I get to see the positive outcome of a case I worked," she said as they walked through the VA medical center together. "Usually the victims disappear into the system and I never know if they recovered." Marcus was scheduled for physical therapy 3 times a week to strengthen his knee and rebuild the muscle mass he'd lost during years of inadequate medical care. The orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Patricia Kim, had been optimistic about his prognosis with proper treatment and rehabilitation. "You'll never be 22 again," she'd told him with a smile. "But there's no reason you can't regain most of your mobility and strength. The key is consistency and patience." The housing assistance had allowed Marcus to move out of his old neighborhood to a small apartment in a quieter part of the city. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, safe, and affordable. Most importantly, it was within walking distance of the community center where he'd accepted a position as a youth counselor and self-defense instructor. The job had come through an unexpected connection. Michael Chen, the detective who'd taken his statement, had a brother who ran programs for at-risk youth. When he'd heard about Marcus's background and recent actions, he'd immediately thought of the perfect fit. "These kids need to see what real strength looks like," David Chen had explained during Marcus's interview. "Not the fake tough guy posturing they see on the streets, but the kind of quiet confidence that comes from actually being able to protect others." Marcus's first day at the Riverside Community Center was both nervous and exciting. He'd worked with military personnel of all ages during his service, but civilian teenagers were an entirely different challenge. The kids who attended the center's after-school programs came from difficult backgrounds: broken homes, poverty, neighborhoods where violence was a daily reality. His first class consisted of 12 teenagers, 8 boys and 4 girls, ranging in age from 14 to 17. They eyed him with the wariness of young people who'd learned not to trust adults too quickly. Marcus understood that look. He'd seen it on the faces of Afghan children who'd witnessed too much violence and loss. "I'm not here to lecture you about staying out of trouble," he began, standing in front of the group without notes or prepared speeches. "I'm here because sometimes trouble finds you whether you're looking for it or not. When that happens, you need to know how to handle yourself." One of the older boys, a 17-year-old named Carlos who already had gang tattoos on his arms, raised his hand skeptically. "You're that guy from the news, right? The one who fought off 3 dudes?" "I'm the guy who got lucky," Marcus replied honestly. "Those men were dangerous and I got hurt badly trying to stop them. But someone needed help and walking away wasn't an option." "Why not?" asked a 14-year-old girl named Maria. "Why was it your problem?" Marcus considered the question carefully. It was the same thing he'd been asking himself for weeks. Because when you have the ability to help someone, and you choose not to, you become part of the problem. In the military, we had a saying, "Leave no one behind." That doesn't just apply to soldiers. Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself settling into a routine that felt more meaningful than anything he'd done since leaving the Marines. His mornings were spent in physical therapy, rebuilding his strength and mobility under professional supervision. His afternoons were at the community center, working with teenagers who reminded him why his service had mattered in the first place. The self-defense classes were popular, but Marcus quickly realized that the kids needed more than just physical techniques. They needed to understand the difference between violence and protection, between aggression and strength. Many of them had grown up in environments where fighting was seen as the primary solution to problems. "Real strength isn't about hurting people," he explained during one session, demonstrating how to escape from various grabs and holds. "It's about protecting yourself and others without causing unnecessary harm. The goal is to get away safely, not to prove how tough you are." Carlos had become one of his most attentive students, despite his initial skepticism. The teenager was smart and athletic, but he'd been heading toward serious trouble before enrolling in the program. His older brother was already in prison for gang-related charges, and Carlos had been following the same path. "My brother always said you gotta fight to earn respect," Carlos mentioned after one particularly intense training session. "But you earned respect by getting beat up helping someone you didn't even know. I don't understand that." "Your brother isn't wrong about fighting for respect," Marcus replied, toweling off sweat. "But there are different kinds of fights. Fighting to hurt others gets you fear, not respect. Fighting to protect others gets you both respect and something much more valuable." "What's that?" "The ability to sleep at night knowing you did the right thing." Sarah Martinez had become a regular visitor, both as a friend and as someone documenting the positive changes in Marcus's life for a follow-up article. Her original story had been picked up by several national news outlets, generating enough attention to secure additional funding for the community center's programs. "You've become something of a local celebrity," she observed, watching Marcus work with a group of younger children who were learning basic safety awareness. "How does that feel?" "Weird," Marcus admitted. "I keep expecting someone to realize they've made a mistake and take it all away." "That's survivor's guilt talking," Sarah said gently. She'd been researching veteran mental health issues for her journalism program and recognized the symptoms. "You deserve good things to happen to you, Marcus, especially after what you've been through." The legal proceedings against his attackers had concluded the previous month. Rico Valdez had been sentenced to 12 years in prison for aggravated assault and attempted robbery. Tank Morrison received 8 years, and Jimmy Santos got 5 years as part of a plea agreement. Marcus had testified at each sentencing hearing, describing the attack and its aftermath in clear, factual terms. "Justice doesn't always feel satisfying," Detective Chen had warned him before the final hearing. "These guys will eventually get out of prison, and their victims will still be dealing with the consequences of their actions." Marcus had understood what he meant. Sarah still had nightmares about the attack, and Marcus's own sleep was sometimes disturbed by dreams that mixed the recent violence with older combat memories. Justice was about consequences and deterrence, not healing. Healing came from other sources. One of those sources was the growing sense of purpose Marcus felt in his work with the teenagers. Several of his students had made significant positive changes in their lives, choosing education and legitimate employment over the street life that had seemed inevitable before. Maria, the 14-year-old who'd questioned why he'd helped a stranger, had become particularly close to Marcus and his story. She'd been failing most of her classes and skipping school regularly before joining the program. Now she was maintaining a B average and talking about college. "You showed me that adults can actually be trusted sometimes," she told him during one of their counseling sessions. "Most of the grown-ups in my life have only cared about themselves. But you got hurt helping someone you didn't know. That's different." As autumn turned to winter, Marcus realized that his life had stabilized in ways he hadn't experienced since his military discharge. His medical care was comprehensive and effective, his housing was secure, and his job provided both income and satisfaction. Most importantly, he felt like he was making a meaningful contribution to his community. The recognition had continued to grow. The mayor's office had presented him with a Civilian Heroism Award. The local Marine Corps League had made him an honorary member and asked him to speak at their monthly meetings. Several schools had invited him to talk to students about courage and community service. 6 months after the attack that changed everything, Marcus stood before a packed auditorium at the local high school, preparing to deliver the keynote speech for their annual Veterans Day assembly. The invitation had come through David Chen, whose youth program had expanded significantly due to the attention Marcus's story had generated. Looking out at the sea of young faces, Marcus felt the familiar flutter of nervousness that preceded any public speaking engagement. But these weren't the audiences of reporters and community leaders who'd wanted to hear his story over the past months. These were teenagers, kids who might be facing some of the same challenges and choices that his students at the community center dealt with every day. 6 months ago, "I was facing eviction from a rundown apartment," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. "I was broke, struggling with untreated injuries from my military service and honestly wondering if things would ever get better. I felt forgotten by a country I'd served and invisible in a community that seemed to have no place for me. The auditorium was remarkably quiet for a room full of teenagers. Marcus had learned that kids could sense authenticity, and they responded to speakers who talked to them rather than at them. That night, when I saw Sarah being attacked, I had a choice. I could have walked away, called the police, and hoped for the best. No one would have blamed me. I was already dealing with more problems than I could handle, and getting involved would only make things worse. He paused, looking directly at several students in the front rows. But I'd learned something during my time in the Marines that I'd forgotten in civilian life. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't about what's convenient or safe or smart. Sometimes it's just about recognizing that you have the power to help someone and choosing to use that power. Maria was sitting in the third row with several other students from the community center program. She'd been selected as one of the student representatives for the assembly, a recognition of how dramatically her academic performance had improved over the past months. Marcus caught her eye and smiled slightly before continuing. I'm not telling you this story to convince you that I'm some kind of hero. I got lucky that night. Lucky that I survived. Lucky that help arrived when it did. And especially lucky that my actions led to positive changes in my life. But luck isn't something you can count on. Carlos sat beside Maria, wearing a button-down shirt instead of his usual gang colors. He'd recently started his senior year after spending 2 years behind in credits, and his teachers reported that he was excelling in both academics and leadership. The transformation wasn't complete yet, but the direction was clear. What you can count on, Marcus continued, is the knowledge that every choice you make affects not just your own life, but the lives of people around you. When you choose to walk away from violence instead of participating in it, you're protecting your community. When you choose education over quick money, you're investing in everyone's future. When you choose to help someone who needs it, you're making the world a little bit better. After his speech, Marcus was surrounded by students asking questions and sharing their own stories. Some talked about family members who'd served in the military. Others described situations where they'd had to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right. A few quietly asked about the community center programs and how they could get involved. One student, a 16-year-old named Jerome, hung back until most of the crowd had dispersed. He was tall and thin, with the cautious posture of someone who'd learned to expect trouble. When he finally approached Marcus, his voice was barely above a whisper. "My mom works 2 jobs and I help take care of my little sister," Jerome said, avoiding eye contact. "Sometimes I see stuff happening in our neighborhood, bad stuff, and I want to help, but I'm scared. If something happens to me, who's going to take care of my family?" Marcus nodded thoughtfully. It was a question he'd heard variations of many times, and it never had an easy answer. "That's a legitimate concern, Jerome. Being brave doesn't mean being stupid. Sometimes helping means calling the police instead of getting directly involved. Sometimes it means being a good witness instead of trying to be a hero. But what if the police don't come in time? What if nobody else cares enough to help? Then you do what you can with what you have," Marcus replied. "But you also remember that taking care of your family is a form of heroism too. Your mom and sister need you alive and safe more than they need you to be a neighborhood guardian." The conversation continued for several more minutes, touching on themes that had become central to Marcus's work with young people. The balance between courage and wisdom, the difference between helping and interfering, the importance of making choices that you could live with regardless of the outcome. Driving home from the school, Marcus reflected on how completely his life had transformed. The small apartment he now called home was warm and comfortable, a stark contrast to the cold, drafty room he'd occupied 6 months earlier. His refrigerator was well stocked, his medical bills were manageable, and his bank account showed a positive balance for the first time in years. But the material improvements, significant as they were, weren't the most important changes. The sense of purpose he'd found in working with young people had filled a void that had existed since his military discharge. The respect and recognition from his community had restored a sense of dignity that poverty and struggle had gradually eroded. Most importantly, he'd reconnected with the values that had originally motivated him to serve his country. Honor, courage, and commitment weren't just military concepts, they were principles that could guide anyone's life, regardless of their circumstances or background. Sarah's follow-up article had been published the previous month, documenting the ripple effects of that night's violence. The community center had expanded its programs to serve twice as many young people. The local police department had implemented new training protocols for responding to violent crimes. Several other veterans had come forward to access services they'd been reluctant to pursue on their own. Master Sergeant Williams had visited the previous week with news that still felt surreal. The Marine Corps Community Services Program was using Marcus's story as a case study for how to better support transitioning veterans. His experience had highlighted gaps in the system that were now being addressed at the national level. "You've probably helped more Marines than you realize," she'd told him. "Sometimes one person's story can change how everyone else understands a problem." The recognition continued to feel uncomfortable at times, but Marcus had learned to accept it as part of his responsibility. If his experience could help other veterans navigate the challenges of civilian life, then the attention served a purpose beyond personal gratification. Winter was giving way to early spring as Marcus pulled into his parking space and climbed the stairs to his apartment. His knee, strengthened by months of physical therapy, handled the steps easily. Inside, he found a message on his answering machine from David Chen, asking if he'd be interested in expanding his work to include other community centers in the area. Looking out his window at the quiet street below, Marcus thought about the journey that had brought him to this point. 6 months ago, he'd been a forgotten veteran struggling with poverty and despair. Tonight, he was a valued member of his community with meaningful work and a secure future. The transformation hadn't happened because of any grand plan or brilliant strategy. It had happened because, in a moment of crisis, he'd chosen to act according to his deepest values rather than his immediate interests. That choice had set in motion a series of events that changed not just his own life, but the lives of many others. As he prepared for bed, Marcus's thoughts turned to his students at the community center and the young people he'd spoken to earlier that day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to make a positive difference. The work was far from finished, but for the first time in years, he felt genuinely optimistic about the future. The attack that had nearly cost him his life had instead given him something he'd lost without realizing it: a reason to believe that individual actions mattered, that courage could be contagious, and that sometimes the worst moments in our lives can become the foundation for something better than we ever imagined possible. Marcus turned off the lights and settled into sleep, no longer haunted by nightmares of war or worried about tomorrow's problems. Instead, he dreamed of the teenagers he worked with, of the positive changes they were making in their own lives, and of the continuing possibility that one person's choice to do the right thing could ripple outward in ways that changed everything.